Hey everyone, and welcome back to another journey into the dusty corners of history where love meets politics and romance gets tangled up in property law. Tonight we're diving into the fascinating, occasionally horrifying, and surprisingly bureaucratic world of ancient Roman marriage ceremonies. So go ahead and get comfortable, maybe adjust that pillow, turn on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see our little community of night owls and history lovers scattered across the globe. Now, before we begin, take a moment to like the video if you genuinely enjoy these sleepy, historical deep dives, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Tonight's story involves togas, goats, religious ceremonies that would make modern wedding planners weep, and enough political maneuvering to make a congressional hearing look like a casual coffee date. So dim those lights, maybe brew some chamomile tea, and let's ease into the surprisingly complex world of Roman matrimony together. In the height of the Roman Republic and early empire, marriage wasn't what we might call a romantic endeavor. It was business, pure and simple, wrapped in religious ceremony and sprinkled with just enough tradition to make everyone feel like the gods were paying attention. Picture ancient Rome at its peak. Marble columns gleaming in Mediterranean sunlight. Senators in pristine togas debating the fate of nations. And wealthy families treating their children's marriages like medieval chess moves, except the pawns were actual people with actual feelings. Roman marriage, or matrimonium as they called it, was fundamentally about creating alliances, transferring property, and producing legitimate heirs who could carry on the family name and political influence. Love, well, that was a pleasant bonus if it happened to show up at the wedding. Most of the time, the bride and groom were meeting each other for maybe the second or third time, having been introduced briefly during negotiations between their fathers. Romance, as we understand it, was something that might develop after the ceremony, assuming both parties survived the political intrigue and didn't poison each other first. The Romans had a saying, amor sicut est, love is blind. What they didn't mention is that in Roman high society, love was also often irrelevant, inconvenient, and occasionally treasonous. A good marriage was measured not in butterflies and stolen glances, but in dowry amounts, political connections, and the strategic value of combining two family fortunes. It was capitalism with flower petals. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all this cold calculation, Romans developed some of the most elaborate, symbolic, and genuinely beautiful wedding ceremonies in the ancient world. They understood that even a business transaction needed pageantry, that even an arranged marriage deserved a proper celebration, and that the gods required their due respect before any union could be considered legitimate. The result was a multi-day affair that combined religious ritual, family theatre, legal contracts, and enough wine to make everyone forget they were essentially attending a corporate merger. The Roman wedding season ran from June through early October, with June being particularly favoured because it was sacred to Juno, the goddess of marriage and family. May was absolutely forbidden for weddings. It was the month of the dead, when the spirits of ancestors roamed the earth, and nobody wanted ghostly in-laws crashing the reception. March was also avoided because it was the month of war, dedicated to Mars, and apparently even Romans understood that starting a marriage during war season was asking for trouble. For the wealthy elite, the patrician families who ran the empire and owned most of everything worth owning a wedding, was an opportunity to display their wealth, their taste, their political connections, and their devotion to tradition. These weren't intimate garden ceremonies with close family. These were productions that could last for days, involve hundreds of guests, and cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The Romans believed that if you were going to do something, you should do it with style, even if that something was essentially selling your daughter to secure a trade agreement. The wedding preparations began days, sometimes weeks, in advance, and for the bride, it was a process that combined religious ritual, beauty treatments, and what can only be described as elaborate costume theatre. Roman women, particularly those from noble families, understood that their wedding day was quite possibly the most important day of their lives, not because of romance, but because it determined their entire future social status, financial security, and political influence. The night before her wedding, the Roman bride performed a ritual that was both touching and slightly melancholy. She offered her childhood toys to the household gods, the Lares and Penates. This wasn't just symbolic. It was a formal goodbye to childhood, a recognition that after tomorrow she would be a wife, expected to manage a household, produce children, and navigate the treacherous waters of Roman high society. Imagine being 16 or 17 years old, standing in your family's private shrine, placing your favorite doll next to offerings of wine and honey, knowing that this was the last night you would sleep in your childhood bed. On the morning of the wedding, the bride's preparations began before dawn. Roman beauty standards were intensive. Her hair was arranged in a style called the sex crines, 6 elaborate braids wound around her head and secured with ribbons. This wasn't just fashion, the 6 braids were sacred, each one representing a different aspect of marital harmony and fertility. The styling alone could take hours, performed by skilled slave women who specialized in bridal preparation. Getting it wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it was considered bad luck for the entire marriage. The bride's face was painted with white lead, and chalk pale skin was considered the height of beauty, suggesting a life of leisure spent indoors, rather than labouring in the sun like a common farmer. Her cheeks were reddened with ochre or cinnabar, her eyebrows darkened with soot, and her lips stained with wine dregs or red ochre. The overall effect was dramatic, almost mask-like, transforming the bride into a living representation of Venus herself. The makeup process was an art form in itself, requiring hours of careful application by skilled slave women who had been trained specifically in bridal beauty preparation. The white lead powder was mixed with various oils and perfumes to create a smooth, even coating that would last throughout the long day of ceremonies. Different regions of the empire had their own preferred cosmetic recipes: Egyptian kohl for the eyes, Gallic rouge for the cheeks, Spanish antimony for dramatic eyeliner effects. But the cosmetics served purposes beyond mere beauty. The thick white makeup helped to mask any imperfections, blemishes, or signs of nervousness that might suggest the bride was anything less than perfect. The dramatic colouring created an otherworldly appearance that emphasised the bride's transition from ordinary mortal woman to sacred figure blessed by the gods. And the time-consuming application process gave the bride hours to mentally prepare for her new role, to practice the demure expressions and modest gestures that would be expected of her throughout the ceremony. The perfumes applied during the makeup process were equally important. Roman brides wore complex combinations of scents designed to appeal to different gods and goddesses: rose oil for Venus, myrrh for the household deities, frankincense for Jupiter. The layering of these fragrances created a unique scent signature that would be associated with the bride's wedding day for the rest of her life. Years later, a whiff of the same perfume combination could transport her back to those nervous morning hours when her entire future hung in the balance. But the most important part of the bride's costume was her wedding dress, a long white tunic called a tunica recta, woven from scratch on an ancient type of loom called a tela recta. This wasn't just any tunic, it was woven by the bride herself, or by women in her household, using wool that had been spun by hand. The process could take months, and the quality of the weaving was seen as a reflection of the bride's domestic skills and her family's attention to tradition. Over the tunic, she wore a flame-coloured veil called a flammeum, bright orange-red, like the flames of Vesta's sacred fire. The colour was significant. It symbolised passion, fertility, and the bride's transition from the protection of her father's household gods to those of her husband. The veil was arranged to cover her face completely. because a Roman bride was not supposed to see the outside world clearly on her wedding day. Everything was meant to be filtered through the sacred flame-coloured fabric, transforming ordinary daylight into something mystical and otherworldly. Around her waist, she wore a special belt called the cingulum, tied in what was known as the knot of Hercules. This knot was deliberately complex and could only be untied by her husband on their wedding night, a bit of ancient Roman symbolism that was both practical and deeply symbolic. The belt represented her virginity, her family's honour, and her husband's future exclusive rights to her body. Romantic, isn't it? On her feet, she wore yellow sandals, and around her neck, jewellery that had been blessed by the household priests. Every detail was specified by centuries of tradition. Every element carried religious and social significance. The Roman bride wasn't just getting dressed, she was transforming herself into a living symbol of proper womanhood, family honour, and divine favour. The final touch was her wedding crown, made of flowers and herbs that she had picked herself, traditionally marjoram, which was sacred to Venus and believed to ensure a happy marriage. The crown was delicate, fragrant, and heartbreakingly temporary, just like the innocence it represented. While the bride was being transformed into a religious icon, the groom had his own preparations to attend to, though they were considerably less elaborate and significantly more focused on demonstrating his worthiness as a Roman citizen and future head of household. Roman masculinity was all about control, dignity, and the ability to manage property, including, unfortunately, one's wife. The groom began his wedding day with religious observances at the family shrine, offering prayers to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the king of the gods, and asking for divine blessing on his upcoming marriage. This wasn't just ceremony. In Roman religion, the god's approval was considered essential for any important undertaking, and a marriage without divine blessing was likely to be plagued by misfortune, infertility, and financial ruin. His wedding attire was the finest toga he owned, bleached to brilliant white and draped with the precision that marked a man of education and refinement. Romans were obsessively concerned with how their togas were arranged too loose, and you looked slovenly, too tight, and you appeared anxious. Wrinkles in the wrong places could suggest moral weakness or insufficient attention to detail. The groom's toga was inspected by family members and adjusted by slaves who specialized in proper draping. In a society where your clothing announced your social status, political affiliations, and personal character, there was no room for sartorial error. Underneath the toga, he wore a clean white tunic, leather sandals that had been polished to a high shine, and whatever jewelry was appropriate to his social rank. Wealthy Romans might wear gold rings indicating their status, while members of the senatorial class wore special purple stripes on their togas. Everything was calculated to communicate his family's position in society and his personal worthiness as a husband. But the groom's most important preparation was political rather than physical. Roman marriages among the elite were fundamentally political alliances, and the groom spent the morning receiving final instructions from his father about the terms of the marriage contract, the dowry arrangements, and the expectations for the couple's future relationship. These weren't romantic conversations, they were business meetings, covering everything from property rights to inheritance laws to the political obligations that came with joining two powerful families. The groom also received visits from his political allies, friends who came to offer congratulations and to reinforce the social networks that made the marriage valuable in the first place. A Roman wedding wasn't just about two young people getting married. It was about two families, two sets of business interests, and two political factions creating a formal alliance. The groom's friends and associates were essentially witnessing a treaty signing, and their presence added weight and legitimacy to the proceedings. Roman law required that the groom be at least 14 years old and mentally competent to enter into a legal contract. Most patrician men married in their late 20s or early 30s, after they had established their careers, served in the military, and proven their ability to manage property and political responsibilities. By the time they reached the altar, they were expected to be fully formed Roman citizens, ready to take on the responsibilities of managing a household, guiding a wife, and raising the next generation of Romans. The groom's bachelor party, if you could call it that, was a much more restrained affair than modern equivalents. The night before the wedding, he might dine with his male friends and family members, but the focus was on serious conversation about marriage, citizenship, and responsibility rather than drunken revelry. Romans believed that a man about to be married should be contemplating the gravity of his new obligations, not stumbling home drunk and dishevelled. On the morning of the wedding, the groom's final act of preparation was to consult the auspices, the flight patterns of birds, the behaviour of sacred chickens, or other omens that might indicate the god's attitude toward the upcoming ceremony. If the signs were unfavourable, the wedding could be postponed indefinitely. No Roman wanted to start a marriage under a bad omen, no matter how politically advantageous the alliance might be. Before any religious ceremonies could begin, there was the small matter of the marriage contract, a document that made modern prenuptial agreements look like love letters. Roman marriage was, first and foremost, a legal and financial arrangement, and every detail had to be negotiated, documented, and witnessed by enough prominent citizens to ensure that nobody could later claim they didn't understand what they were agreeing to. The negotiations typically took place in the groom's house, in a formal reception room decorated with portraits of his ancestors and symbols of his family's achievements. This wasn't an accident. The setting was designed to remind everyone present of the political and social weight behind the marriage contract. The bride's father, accompanied by his own advisors and family members, would meet with the groom's father and their respective teams of lawyers, accountants, and political allies. The central issue was always the dowry, the money, property, and goods that the bride's family provided to make the marriage attractive to the groom's family. In wealthy Roman families, dowries could be enormous, sometimes including entire estates, urban properties, slaves, livestock, jewelry, and cash payments that could fund military campaigns or major business ventures. The dowry wasn't a gift, it was an investment, and it remained technically the property of the bride's family, though it was managed by the husband during the marriage. The size and composition of the dowry said everything about the bride's family's wealth, their eagerness for the alliance, and their confidence in the groom's ability to manage their investment wisely. A small dowry might suggest financial difficulties or lack of enthusiasm for the match. A dowry that was too large might indicate desperation or hidden problems that made the bride difficult to marry off. Getting it exactly right required delicate calculations that balanced family honour, political advantage, and cold financial reality. But the dowry was just the beginning. The contract also had to specify what would happen if the marriage ended, and Roman marriages ended frequently, often for political reasons that had nothing to do with the personal compatibility of the couple. If the husband divorced the wife, the dowry had to be returned to her family, along with any interest or profits it had generated. If the wife died childless, the dowry typically stayed with the husband. If she died after producing male heirs, the dowry would be inherited by her sons. Every contingency had to be anticipated and documented. The contract specified the wife's allowance for clothing, jewellery, and personal expenses. It detailed her rights regarding slaves, her authority over household management, and her responsibilities for religious observances. It outlined the husband's obligations to provide for her support, to treat her with appropriate dignity, and to consult with her family on major decisions. Nothing was left to chance or goodwill. One of the most important clauses dealt with adultery specifically, the wife's adultery, since Roman law gave husbands considerably more latitude in their extramarital activities. If the wife was caught in adultery, her husband was legally required to divorce her or face charges himself. The contract specified how such accusations would be investigated, what evidence would be required, and how the dowry would be divided if the marriage ended in scandal. The negotiations could take days or even weeks, with each side's lawyers finding new issues to quibble over, new protections to demand, new contingencies to plan for. Marriage contracts from wealthy Roman families could run to dozens of pages, covering everything from funeral arrangements to inheritance rights for children who might not yet be born. By the time the negotiations were complete, everyone involved understood exactly what they were getting into and exactly what they stood to lose if things went wrong. The complexity of these negotiations often required the services of specialist lawyers who focused exclusively on matrimonial law, accountants who could evaluate the true worth of complex property holdings, and political advisors who understood the implications of various alliance structures. These professionals commanded substantial fees for their services, but wealthy families considered them essential investments in protecting their interests. Consider, for example, the marriage contract between Marcus Crassus's daughter and Pompey's son, a union designed to cement the political alliance between two of Rome's most powerful men. The negotiations reportedly took 6 months and involved teams of lawyers, accountants, and political advisors working around the clock to address every possible contingency. The dowry alone included 3 estates in different provinces, a fleet of merchant ships, mining interests in Spain, and enough gold to fund a military campaign. But the contract went far beyond simple property transfer. It specified that if Pompey's political fortunes declined, the bride's family could reclaim portions of the dowry to protect their investment. If Crassus's business ventures failed, Pompey's family would have first rights to purchase his assets at below market prices. The contract even included clauses governing the children's education, specifying which tutors would be employed, which languages they would learn, and how their political careers would be managed. The military clauses were particularly complex. Both families had extensive interests in supplying the Roman army, and the marriage contract had to address potential conflicts of interest, specify how military contracts would be divided, and establish procedures for resolving disputes that might arise if the families found themselves on opposite sides of civil conflicts. The document included detailed maps showing which territories each family could claim as their sphere of influence, and it established joint ventures for supplying legions in contested regions. Religious obligations formed another major section of typical marriage contracts. The bride's family had to specify which religious festivals they would continue to fund, which temples they would support, and how the costs of major sacrifices would be shared between the families. The groom's family had to guarantee that the bride would be allowed to maintain her devotions to her family's patron deities, while also adopting the religious obligations of her new household. The most delicate negotiations often involved what modern lawyers would call moral clauses, provisions governing the behavior expected from both spouses. These weren't just about adultery, though that was certainly covered in exhaustive detail. The contracts specified standards for public behavior, social obligations, political loyalties, and even personal appearance. A wife might be required to maintain certain beauty standards, to dress in ways that reflected her family's status, and to avoid associations that might damage her husband's political prospects. Dissolution clauses were perhaps the most complex part of any marriage contract, since they had to anticipate every possible reason the marriage might end, and specify exactly how assets would be divided in each scenario. Death in childbirth required different arrangements than death in battle. Divorce for adultery had different financial implications than divorce for political reasons. The contracts even had to address what would happen if one spouse was accused of treason, a very real concern in the politically volatile world of the late Republic. The final contract was signed in the presence of witnesses, sealed with the family rings of both parties, and deposited with a reliable third party who could produce it if disputes arose later. Only then, with all the legal and financial details settled, could the actual wedding ceremony begin. Romance, after all, was much safer when it was properly documented and legally protected. The Roman wedding day began before dawn with a series of religious observances that were designed to ensure divine favor for the upcoming marriage. Romans were deeply superstitious people who believed that the gods took a personal interest in human affairs, and no important undertaking could be successful without proper religious preparation. A wedding without divine blessing wasn't just risky, it was essentially guaranteed to end in disaster. The first ritual was the taking of auspices, performed by a priest or an experienced male relative who knew how to read the signs that the gods sent through the natural world. The most common method involved observing the flight patterns of birds. Eagles flying from left to right indicated divine approval, while ravens or crows flying in the opposite direction suggested that the gods were displeased and the ceremony should be postponed. If live birds weren't cooperating, the auspices could be taken from the behavior of sacred chickens kept specifically for this purpose. The chickens were offered grain, and their eating habits were carefully observed. Chickens that ate eagerly and scattered grain widely were a good sign. Chickens that refused to eat or ate listlessly suggested divine disapproval. Yes, the fate of Roman marriages sometimes hung on the appetite of poultry. The Romans took this very seriously. Weather was also scrutinized for divine messages. Clear skies and gentle breezes were favorable, while storms, unusual cloud formations, or unexpected temperature changes could be interpreted as warnings from the gods. If lightning was seen or thunder heard, the ceremony would almost certainly be postponed, since Jupiter was clearly expressing his displeasure. Romans would rather wait weeks for better omens than risk starting a marriage under divine disapproval. Once the auspices were deemed favorable, the morning sacrifices could begin. Both families offered prayers and burned incense at their household shrines, asking the Lares and Penates, the gods who protected the home, to bless the upcoming union and watch over the new household that would be created. The bride made a special offering of her childhood toys and a lock of her hair, symbolically offering her youth to the gods in exchange for their protection in her new role as a wife. The most important sacrifice was offered to Juno, the queen of the gods, and the divine protector of marriage and childbirth. A perfect sheep or goat was chosen young, healthy, with no blemishes or scars that might suggest divine disfavor. The animal was decorated with ribbons and led in procession to the family altar, where it was killed by a priest using a ritual knife that had been blessed and purified for the occasion. The sacrifice had to be performed perfectly. If the priest made any error in the ritual words, if the animal struggled too much or died in an unusual way, if the blood didn't flow properly, or the internal organs showed any abnormality when examined, the entire ceremony would have to be repeated with a new animal. Romans believed that the gods were very particular about how they liked their sacrifices, and any deviation from proper procedure would invalidate the divine blessing. The priest would examine the sacrificed animal's liver, heart, and other organs, looking for signs that would indicate the god's attitude toward the marriage. A healthy liver was essential. It represented the health and prosperity of the upcoming union. Discolored or malformed organs could doom the marriage before it began, suggesting that the gods foresaw disease, infertility, or financial ruin in the couple's future. If all the omens were favorable and the sacrifices accepted, the families could proceed with confidence that the gods approved of their alliance. If the signs were mixed or clearly negative, the wedding would be postponed until more auspicious circumstances could be arranged. No Roman family wanted to risk divine displeasure for the sake of a convenient wedding date. These religious observances weren't just superstition, they were also a practical way to ensure that both families were completely committed to the marriage. If either family was having second thoughts, they could point to unfavorable omens as a reason to delay or reconsider the alliance. It was a face-saving way to back out of a marriage that no longer seemed politically or financially advantageous, without anyone having to admit they'd changed their minds. With the gods properly consulted and appeased, the actual wedding ceremony could begin. Roman weddings weren't held in temples or churches. They were fundamentally domestic affairs, taking place in the bride's family home. where the sacred household gods could witness and bless the proceedings. The ceremony itself was a carefully choreographed blend of ancient religious ritual, legal procedure, and political theatre, designed to transform two individuals into a married couple while simultaneously creating a formal alliance between two families. The guests began arriving in the late morning, and the guest list read like a who's who of Roman society. For wealthy families, a wedding was an opportunity to display their political connections, their social status, and their commitment to Roman tradition. Senators arrived in their togas with purple stripes. Magistrates brought their official retinues. Military commanders wore their decorations, and wealthy matrons displayed their finest jewellery and most elaborate hairstyles. The bride's family home was decorated for the occasion with flowers, ribbons, and garlands made from plants that were sacred to various gods. Roses for Venus, olive branches for Minerva, oak leaves for Jupiter, every detail was chosen for its religious significance. The entrance to the house was draped with white cloth, and the courtyard was arranged with couches and chairs for the guests, following a strict order of precedence that reflected everyone's social rank and political importance. The ceremony began with the bride being led from her private quarters by her mother and female relatives. She moved slowly, her face covered by the flame-coloured veil, guided carefully because she was not supposed to see clearly until the moment she was formally handed over to her husband. The symbolism was clear. She was leaving behind her old life and old identity, stepping blindly into an unknown future under her husband's protection and authority. The groom waited in the courtyard, surrounded by his male relatives and political allies. When the bride appeared, a ritual specialist called the pranuba, usually an older woman who'd been married only once and whose marriage was considered particularly blessed, took the bride's right hand and placed it in the groom's right hand. This was the central moment of the entire ceremony, the dextrarum iunctio, or joining of right hands, the moment when the couple became legally married under Roman law. But the hand joining was just the beginning. The couple then stood before the household altar, while a priest or senior family member read the marriage formula. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia, a ritualized declaration that the wife was taking her husband's identity and becoming part of his family, his household, and his political and social networks. The bride's individual identity was symbolically dissolved into her husband's, a legal and religious transformation that gave her new status as a married woman, but cost her the independence she had enjoyed as a daughter. The wedding ceremony included multiple smaller rituals, each with its own symbolic meaning. The couple shared a piece of spelt cake, an ancient grain that was considered especially sacred. This was called the confereatio, literally eating together, and it symbolized their commitment to share their lives and their resources. They drank wine from the same cup, symbolizing their unity and their mutual commitment to the household gods. They exchanged rings, though not on the finger we use today. Romans believed that a nerve ran directly from the fourth finger of the left hand to the heart, so that's where the wedding ring was placed. Throughout the ceremony, the guests called out traditional blessings and good wishes. Feliciter, they shouted, may you be happy, though happiness, as we've seen, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than the primary goal of Roman marriage. The real wishes were for fertility, prosperity, political advantage, and the kind of domestic harmony that would allow both families to benefit from their new alliance. The ceremony was punctuated by music flutes, lyres, and drums played traditional wedding songs that had been handed down for generations. Some of these songs were beautiful and melodic, celebrating love and fertility. Others were deliberately bawdy, filled with sexual jokes and innuendos that would make a modern wedding planner blush. Romans believed that a little ribald humour would encourage fertility and ward off the evil eye, so the ruder the songs got, the better luck the couple would have. The religious component of the ceremony concluded with a formal sacrifice, usually a pig, which was sacred to the earth goddess Ceres and symbolized fertility and abundance. The couple stood hand in hand while the priest killed the animal and examined its organs for final confirmation that the gods approved of the marriage. Only when the sacrifice was deemed acceptable could the ceremony be considered complete and the couple legally married. But the day was far from over. The ceremony was followed by a wedding feast that could last well into the evening, and then came the most dramatic part of the entire proceedings: the ritualized abduction of the bride and her formal transfer from her father's household to her husband's. The Romans knew how to turn even a property transfer into compelling theatre. The wedding feast that followed the ceremony was where Roman extravagance truly shone. This wasn't just dinner, it was a carefully orchestrated display of wealth, taste, political connections, and social sophistication that could make or break a family's reputation. The feast was held in the bride's family home, but the expense was typically shared between both families, each trying to outdo the other in demonstrating their prosperity and their commitment to making the alliance successful. The menu for a wealthy Roman wedding feast was a monument to excess and culinary creativity. The Romans had access to ingredients from across their empire: spices from India, silk from China, exotic animals from Africa, fish from the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean. A typical feast might include multiple courses featuring peacock, flamingo, ostrich, wild boar, various types of fish both common and rare, elaborate pastries shaped like gods and mythological creatures, and wines from the most prestigious vineyards in Italy and Greece. But the true artistry lay in the preparation and presentation. Roman chefs were master showmen, who understood that a wedding feast was as much about spectacle as sustenance. A single dish might take days to prepare, with elaborate sauces made from dozens of ingredients, garnishes that required artistic skill to arrange, and presentations that bordered on the theatrical. Peacock was a particular favourite for wedding feasts, not just because of its expense, but because of the symbolic meanings associated with the bird. Sacred to Juno, the queen of the gods and protector of marriage, peacock represented beauty, pride, and fertility. But serving peacock wasn't simply a matter of roasting the bird. Roman chefs developed elaborate techniques for preserving and reattaching the bird's magnificent tail feathers, creating the illusion that a living peacock was resting on the serving platter, its iridescent plumage fanned in full display. The preparation of such dishes was a closely guarded secret among the most skilled chefs. The peacock's skin had to be carefully removed in one piece, the meat deboned and seasoned with exotic spices, then sewn back into the skin with nearly invisible stitches. The feathers were treated with special preservatives and attached with thin wires that allowed them to be positioned naturally. The final result was a dish that looked alive, but had been transformed into a culinary masterpiece that could feed dozens of wedding guests. Fish presentations were equally elaborate. Roman chefs prized unusual species lampreys from distant rivers, massive tuna from the deep Mediterranean, rare shellfish from exotic coastlines. These were often presented whole, surrounded by elaborate arrangements of vegetables, fruits, and sauces that created underwater garden scenes on the serving platters. Live fish might be brought to the table in glass bowls, killed and prepared in front of the guest to ensure absolute freshness, then served immediately while still twitching. The wines served at wedding feasts were selected with the same attention to symbolism and display as the food. Certain vintages were considered especially auspicious for weddings' wines from vineyards sacred to Bacchus, aged wines that represented the hope for a long and prosperous marriage, sweet wines that symbolized the joy of matrimony. The most prestigious families served wines that had been aging for decades, sometimes bottles that had been laid down when the bride or groom was born, finally opened to celebrate their wedding day. Wine service itself was a carefully choreographed performance. Slave cupbearers, chosen for their beauty and trained in proper serving techniques, would mix the wine with water in precise ratios that varied according to the status of each guest, the time of day, and the stage of the feast. The mixing was done in beautiful craters, large decorative bowls that were often family heirlooms passed down through generations. The most wealthy families owned craters made of gold or silver, decorated with scenes from mythology or family history, worth more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. The presentation was as important as the ingredients. Roman cooks were artists who created dishes that were meant to amaze and impress as much as nourish. A roasted peacock might be presented with its feathers restored, giving the illusion that a live bird was lying on the platter. Fish were arranged to look like they were swimming through gardens of vegetables. Pastries were sculpted to look like temples, gods, or scenes from mythology. Everything was calculated to demonstrate not just wealth, but sophistication and cultural refinement. The seating arrangement at the wedding feast was a complex social map that reflected every guest's political importance, family connections, and current standing in Roman society. The most honoured guests reclined on couches near the bride and groom, while less important attendees were seated progressively farther away. The arrangement was so important that families employed specialists whose only job was to determine the proper precedence for wedding seating. Getting it wrong could create political enemies that might last for generations. Slaves moved constantly through the dining room, serving course after course, refilling wine cups, and ensuring that every guest felt properly attended to. The number and quality of the slaves was itself a mark of status. Wealthy families might employ dozens of servers for a wedding feast, each trained in specific aspects of food service, wine pouring, or guest assistance. The slaves' clothing, appearance, and behavior were carefully managed to reflect credit on their owner's taste and management skills. The wine flowed freely, but it was diluted with water according to strict social customs. Romans looked down on anyone who drank undiluted wine. It was considered barbaric and showed a lack of self-control. The wine was mixed in large vessels called craters, and the ratio of wine to water was carefully calculated to encourage sociability without promoting drunken behavior that might lead to political indiscretions or social embarrassments. Entertainment was provided throughout the feast. Musicians played traditional songs, dancers performed in honor of various gods, and poets recited verses celebrating the bride's beauty, the groom's worthiness, and the political wisdom of the alliance between their families. Some of the entertainment was deliberately comic, including actors who performed satirical skits about marriage, domestic life, and the challenges of living with in-laws. Roman wedding entertainment could be surprisingly bawdy, based on the belief that laughter and sexual humour encouraged fertility. The political dimension of the feast was as important as the culinary dimension. This was an opportunity for both families to demonstrate their networks, to introduce useful connections, and to cement alliances that went far beyond the marriage itself. Senators discussed legislation over the roasted boar. Military commanders negotiated supply contracts between courses, and wealthy merchants arranged trading partnerships while sampling the imported delicacies. The feast also provided an opportunity for gift-giving that was as much about political positioning as generosity. Wedding gifts were expected to reflect the giver's status and their assessment of the marriage's political importance. Wealthy families might give slaves, land, jewelry, or artwork. Less wealthy, but politically connected guests might offer their services, their influence, or their support in future endeavours. Every gift was carefully noted and would create obligations that could be called in for years to come. The bride and groom, meanwhile, were essentially ornamental figures at their own wedding feast. They were expected to appear happy and grateful, to accept congratulations graciously, and to demonstrate their worthiness as representatives of their respective families. The bride, in particular, had to navigate the challenging task of appearing modestly pleased with her new situation, while also showing appropriate appreciation for the political and social advantages of her marriage. As the afternoon wore on and the wine took effect, the conversation became more animated, the political discussions more frank, and the entertainment more risque. But even in their cups, Romans maintained a sense of social propriety that kept the feast from descending into the kind of chaos that would embarrass the families or create political problems. The wedding feast was, after all, as much a business function as a celebration, and nobody wanted to damage their reputation for the sake of a few extra cups of wine. As evening approached and the wedding feast began to wind down, the most dramatic and symbolically complex part of the entire Roman wedding began: the ritualized abduction of the bride. This wasn't a spontaneous romantic gesture. It was a carefully choreographed theatrical performance that reenacted one of Rome's founding myths, while simultaneously accomplishing the legal and social transfer of the bride from her father's household to her husband's. The ceremony began with the bride appearing to resist leaving her family home. This resistance was entirely scripted. She would cling to her mother, weep for her childhood home, and beg not to be taken away. Her female relatives would comfort her and pretend to try to protect her from being carried off. The groom and his male friends would then overcome this resistance and ceremonially capture the bride, lifting her up and carrying her away from the only home she had ever known. The symbolism was complex and layered. On one level, the mock abduction reenacted the legendary rape of the Sabine women, the mythical event that Romans believed had provided wives for the first generation of Roman men and established Rome as a proper city rather than just a collection of male refugees and outcasts. By reenacting this founding myth, every Roman wedding connected the individual couple to the largest story of Roman civilization and reminded everyone present that marriage was fundamentally about the perpetuation of Roman society and Roman values. But the abduction also served a more practical psychological purpose. It allowed the bride to express grief about leaving her family, while also demonstrating that she was being taken rather than going willingly. In a society that valued female modesty and submission, a bride who appeared too eager to leave her father's house might be seen as insufficiently attached to her family or inappropriately forward in her behavior. The ritual resistance allowed her to show proper filial devotion while still participating in the transfer to her new household. The procession that followed the abduction was one of the most public and festive parts of the entire wedding celebration. The bride was carried through the streets on a litter or in a ceremonial cart, accompanied by a parade that could include hundreds of people, family members, friends, political allies, household slaves, musicians, and curious members of the public who joined the procession as it moved through the city. The procession followed a specific route that took it past important temples, public buildings, and the homes of political allies, allowing maximum visibility for the celebration and ensuring that as many people as possible witnessed the alliance between the two families. The bride was still veiled, but her flame-coloured flammeum was visible from a considerable distance, announcing to the entire city that a wedding was taking place and that the community was gaining a new married couple. Musicians accompanied the procession, playing traditional wedding songs on flutes, lyres, and drums. Some of the music was solemn and religious, honouring the gods and asking for their blessing on the new marriage, but much of it was deliberately boisterous and ribald, filled with sexual jokes and fertility wishes that would make modern wedding planners reach for their smelling salts. The Romans believed that loud, cheerful, and slightly improper music would scare away evil spirits and ensure that the marriage would be blessed with children and prosperity. The crowd called out traditional wedding wishes and threw nuts, flowers, and small coins, symbols of fertility and prosperity. Children ran alongside the procession, scrambling to collect the scattered gifts, and their laughter and excitement added to the festive atmosphere. The throwing of nuts was particularly significant, as nuts were associated with fertility due to their hard shells protecting the soft, life-giving interior, a rather obvious metaphor for the protection of virginity and its eventual fruitful opening in marriage. The groom walked alongside or behind the bride's litter, dressed in his finest toga and accompanied by his own retinue of family and friends. He was expected to appear dignified but pleased, demonstrating his worthiness as a husband, while also showing appropriate respect for the solemnity of the occasion. Like the bride, he was playing a role in a performance that was as much about social and political positioning as it was about personal celebration. The procession also included torchbearers carrying ceremonial flames that had been lit from the sacred fire in the bride's family home. These torches would be used to light the fire in the groom's household shrine, symbolically transferring the bride's connection to her family's gods, while establishing a new relationship with her husband's household deities. The continuity of the sacred fire represented the unbroken connection between past and future generations, a reminder that the marriage was part of a larger pattern of family and social obligation that stretched back to the founding of Rome itself. The wedding procession culminated at the groom's family home, where the bride would spend her wedding night and begin her new life as a married woman. But even arrival at the threshold wasn't the end of the ceremonial requirements. It was the beginning of another series of carefully orchestrated rituals designed to ensure her successful integration into her new household and her proper relationship with her husband's family gods. The first challenge was literally crossing the threshold. Roman religion taught that thresholds were sacred spaces, protected by specific gods and fraught with spiritual significance. A bride who stumbled while crossing the threshold of her new home would bring bad luck to the entire household, not just for the marriage, but for all the family's future endeavours. To prevent this disaster, the bride was traditionally carried across the threshold by her new husband or by his male relatives, ensuring that her feet never touched the potentially dangerous boundary between outside and inside, between her old life and her new identity. This wasn't just superstition, it was practical psychology. The act of being carried into her new home emphasized the bride's dependence on her husband and his family, while also creating a memorable moment that marked the definitive end of her childhood and the beginning of her married life. The physical helplessness of being carried reinforced the social and legal helplessness of her new position as a wife under Roman law. Once safely inside, the bride was formally introduced to her husband's household gods, the Lares and Penates, who would now be responsible for her protection and well-being. This was a solemn religious ceremony conducted at the family shrine, where the bride offered prayers, incense, and small gifts to the deities who governed her new household. She had to learn their names, their preferences, their feast days, and their particular requirements for worship. In essence, she was changing religions as well as families, abandoning her lifelong relationship with her father's gods in favour of deities who were complete strangers to her. The household shrine was typically located in the atrium, the central courtyard of the Roman house, and it was decorated with small statues, paintings, and offerings that represented the family's spiritual life and their connection to their ancestors. The bride's introduction to these gods wasn't just ceremonial, it was a practical necessity, since she would be responsible for their daily care, for maintaining their shrine, and for ensuring that the proper offerings were made on the appropriate occasions. After the religious introductions, the bride was given a tour of her new home by her mother-in-law and the senior women of the household. This wasn't a casual walkthrough. It was a formal instruction in her new duties and responsibilities. She was shown the storage rooms where the household's wealth was kept, the kitchens where meals were prepared, the rooms where the children would be raised, and the private quarters where she would spend much of her married life. Each room came with specific instructions about her role in managing it. The bride learned about the household's routines, its traditions, its relationships with neighbours and clients, and the complex web of social and political obligations that she would now help to maintain. She was introduced to the senior slaves who would assist her, and she learned about their skills, their personalities, and their roles in the household hierarchy. The keys to the household were formally presented to the bride by her mother-in-law, a ritual that symbolized the transfer of domestic authority and responsibility. These weren't just any keys, they were sacred objects that represented the bride's new power over the household's resources, and her responsibility for protecting the family's wealth and reputation. The keys were worn on the bride's belt, as a visible symbol of her status as the mistress of the house, and losing them or having them taken away would be a sign of serious disgrace. But the most important part of the arrival ceremony was the lighting of the household fire. The bride used one of the torches from her wedding procession to light the fire in her new family's shrine, symbolically connecting her old household gods with her new ones, and establishing her role as the keeper of the sacred flame. This fire would burn continuously throughout her marriage, tended by her and by the household slaves under her supervision, and its extinction would be seen as a sign of divine displeasure or domestic chaos. The lighting of the fire was accompanied by prayers and offerings to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, who was considered the protector of married women and the guardian of domestic harmony. The bride offered incense, honey, and wine to Vesta, asking for her blessing on the new household and her protection during the challenges of married life. This wasn't just ceremony. Romans believed that Vesta took a personal interest in every marriage, and that her favour was essential for a successful domestic life. With all the public ceremonies completed, the moment finally arrived for the bride and groom to be alone together, though alone is a relative term in a Roman household filled with family members, guests, and slaves who had very little concept of privacy as we understand it. The wedding night was surrounded by its own set of rituals, expectations, and anxieties that reflected Roman attitudes towards sexuality, marriage, and the proper relationship between husbands and wives. The bride's preparation for her wedding night began with the removal of her wedding costume by the women of her new household, her mother-in-law, sisters-in-law, and senior female slaves, who would become her companions and assistants in married life. The flame-coloured veil was carefully folded and stored away, to be preserved as a sacred relic of her wedding day. The elaborate wedding tunic was replaced with a simple white shift that symbolised her purity and her readiness to fulfil her new role as a wife. But the most symbolically important moment was the untying of the knot of Hercules, the complex belt that had been tied around her waist during the morning preparations. Roman law and custom dictated that only her husband could untie this knot, and his ability to do so successfully was seen as a good omen for their sexual compatibility and future fertility. The knot was deliberately intricate, requiring patience and skill to undo, and its untying was supposed to represent the husband's gentle mastery over his wife's body and sexuality. The groom, meanwhile, had his own preparations to complete. He offered prayers to Priapus, the god of fertility and masculine virility, asking for strength and success in his marital duties. Roman men were expected to be sexually experienced by the time they married, usually through relationships with slaves, prostitutes, or lower-class women, so the wedding night wasn't typically the groom's first sexual encounter, but it was his first encounter with a respectable Roman woman of his own social class, and there were specific expectations about how such encounters should be conducted. Roman sexual culture was complex and often contradictory. Men were expected to be sexually aggressive and dominant, but they were also supposed to show respect for their wives' modesty and inexperience. The ideal was a kind of controlled passion desire that was strong enough to ensure fertility, but restrained enough to preserve the wife's dignity and reputation. Too much enthusiasm might suggest that the husband was sexually uncontrolled, or that the wife was immodestly eager. Too little might indicate impotence, incompatibility, or divine displeasure. The bedroom itself was prepared with flowers, incense, and small offerings to Venus and other gods associated with love and fertility. The bed was strewn with rose petals and herbs that were believed to encourage conception and ensure that any children born from the union would be healthy and strong. Amulets and charms were hidden around the room to ward off evil spirits and protect the couple from curses or bad luck that might be sent by jealous enemies or disapproving gods. The expectations for the bride were particularly complex. She was supposed to be modest, submissive, and inexperienced, but she was also expected to be fertile, responsive, and capable of producing male heirs for her husband's family. Roman marriage manuals, yes, they had those advised wives to be passive but not unresponsive, to show appropriate reluctance but not actual resistance, to be frightened but not traumatized. It was a nearly impossible balance that reflected the contradictory Roman attitudes toward female sexuality. The The morning after the wedding night was almost as ritualized as the night itself. The couple's successful consummation of their marriage was celebrated with special breakfast offerings to the gods, and the bride's mother-in-law would inspect the bedsheets for evidence that the marriage had been properly completed. This wasn't considered embarrassing or intrusive. It was a necessary confirmation that the legal and religious requirements of marriage had been fulfilled, and that the bride had indeed been a virgin on her wedding night. If the evidence was satisfactory, the bride was formally welcomed into her new family with gifts, congratulations, and promises of support and protection. If there were problems, if the bride had not been a virgin, if the groom had been unable to consummate the marriage, or if there were other signs of divine displeasure, the entire alliance between the families might be reconsidered. Roman marriage was too important politically and economically to be left to chance or romantic sentiment. What Romans called the honeymoon wasn't a romantic getaway to an exotic destination. It was a month-long period of intensive training during which the new bride learned to manage her household, navigate her new family relationships, and fulfill her duties as a Roman wife and potential mother. This period was considered crucial for the success of the marriage, since it established the patterns and expectations that would govern the couple's relationship for the rest of their lives. The bride's education began immediately after the wedding night with instruction from her mother-in-law in the practical skills of household management. Roman wives were expected to oversee the work of dozens or even hundreds of slaves, manage complex budgets, maintain the family's social and political relationships, and ensure that the household ran smoothly and efficiently. This wasn't just domestic work. It was business management on a scale that would challenge modern executives. She learned to keep the household accounts, tracking income from agricultural estates, urban properties, and business investments, while managing expenses for food, clothing, entertainment, religious ceremonies, and political obligations. Roman wives were expected to be financially literate and capable of making important economic decisions when their husbands were away on military campaigns or political duties. The social dimensions of her new role were equally complex. As the wife of a prominent Roman citizen, she would be expected to host dinner parties, manage political salons, and maintain relationships with other elite families that could benefit her husband's career and her family's interests. She learned the intricate rules of precedence that governed social interactions, the proper forms of address for different ranks of Roman society, and the subtle signals that communicated political loyalties and family alliances. Religious duties formed another major component of her education. Roman wives were responsible for maintaining the household shrine, ensuring that proper offerings were made to the family gods, and organizing the religious ceremonies that marked important family events. She learned the names and attributes of dozens of deities, the proper procedures for various sacrifices and offerings, and the calendar of religious festivals that structured the Roman year. The bride also received intensive instruction in the management of pregnancy and childbirth, since producing legitimate heirs was considered her primary obligation as a wife. She learned about fertility rituals, pregnancy taboos, childbirth procedures, and infant care from the older women in her new family. This education was practical rather than romantic. The goal was to ensure that she could produce healthy male children who would carry on the family name and inherit the family's political and economic position. Physical training was also part of the honeymoon period. Roman wives were expected to maintain their health and appearance through careful diet, regular exercise, and attention to personal hygiene. They learned about cosmetics, perfumes, and clothing that would enhance their beauty and demonstrate their family's wealth and taste. But the goal wasn't just personal attractiveness. It was presenting the kind of image that would reflect credit on their husbands and families. The bride's relationship with her husband also required careful negotiation during this period. Roman marriage was fundamentally hierarchical. The husband was the legal head of the household, with nearly absolute authority over his wife's behavior and property. But successful marriages required a degree of cooperation and mutual respect. that went beyond mere legal obligation. The couple had to learn to work together as partners in managing their household and advancing their family's interests. This learning process wasn't always smooth. Many Roman brides experienced what we would now recognize as culture shock as they adjusted to new families, new responsibilities, and new identities. Letters and literature from the period describe young wives who were homesick, overwhelmed, or struggling to meet the complex expectations placed on them. Some marriages failed during this crucial period, when it became clear that the couple was fundamentally incompatible, or that the political alliance wasn't working as expected. But for couples who successfully navigated the honeymoon period, it established the foundation for relationships that could be surprisingly companionate and affectionate, despite their fundamentally unequal legal basis. Roman marriage at its best was a partnership between two people who respected each other's abilities and worked together towards shared goals of family prosperity and social advancement. Not all Roman marriages followed the elaborate pattern we've been describing. The ceremonies and rituals I've outlined were the gold standard for wealthy patrician families, but Roman society included a wide range of social classes, each with their own marriage customs that reflected their economic reality and social status. Understanding these variations reveals just how flexible Roman marriage could be when political necessity or financial constraints demanded adaptation. For plebeian families, the merchants, craftsmen, and small farmers who made up the majority of Roman citizens' marriage ceremonies were considerably simpler and more focused on practical considerations than religious pageantry. A plebeian wedding might consist of little more than a public declaration of intent, a simple feast for close family and friends, and the bride's movement from her father's house to her husband's. The elaborate religious ceremonies, the expensive sacrifices, and the multi-day celebrations were luxuries that most Roman families simply couldn't afford. But even simple plebeian marriages had to meet certain legal requirements to be recognized under Roman law. The couple had to be Roman citizens. They had to be of legal age, 14 for boys, 12 for girls, and they had to have the consent of their fathers or guardians. The marriage had to be publicly declared and witnessed by other citizens, and there had to be some form of dowry arrangement, even if it consisted of nothing more than the bride's clothing and personal possessions. Regional variations in marriage customs added another layer of complexity to the Roman system. In Egypt, which retained many of its ancient traditions even under Roman rule, marriages often included elaborate ceremonies, honouring Isis and other Egyptian deities, alongside the required Roman rituals. Egyptian brides wore distinctive gold jewellery that had been blessed in temples along the Nile, and the marriage contracts often included provisions for mummification and burial according to Egyptian customs. In Gaul, newly conquered Celtic tribes brought their own marriage traditions that Romans found both fascinating and barbaric. Celtic marriages often included hand-fasting ceremonies, where the couple's hands were literally bound together with cords that wouldn't be removed for a year and a day. Celtic brides wore blue body paint made from woad, and their ceremonies included ritual combat between the groom and the bride's male relatives, not to the death, but enough to demonstrate the groom's worthiness as a warrior and protector. The Romans typically allowed these local customs to continue as long as they didn't interfere with Roman law or threaten Roman authority. This created a patchwork of marriage traditions across the empire, with Roman legal requirements providing a common framework, while local customs added distinctive regional flavors to the ceremonies. In the eastern provinces, Greek influence remained strong, and many wealthy Roman families adopted Greek wedding customs that emphasized intellectual and artistic accomplishments rather than purely political considerations. Greek-influenced weddings often included poetry competitions, philosophical debates, and elaborate musical performances that could last for days. The bride and groom were expected to demonstrate their education and cultural sophistication, as well as their family connections and financial resources. Jewish communities throughout the empire maintained their own distinct marriage customs while adapting to Roman legal requirements. Jewish weddings included ancient rituals like the breaking of glass, the 7 blessings, and the chuppah ceremony. But they also had to satisfy Roman citizenship requirements and property laws. This sometimes created complex situations where couples were married according to Jewish law, but not Roman law, or vice versa. Freed slaves, former slaves who had been granted their freedom, occupied a complex position in Roman society and had their own marriage customs that reflected their unique legal status. Freedmen could marry other freedmen or freeborn citizens, but their marriages were often complicated by ongoing obligations to their former masters. Many freedmen marriages were essentially business partnerships designed to combine resources and improve both parties' economic prospects. Slaves, of course, couldn't legally marry at all under Roman law, but they did form relationships that were recognized within the slave community and sometimes by their owners. These relationships, called contubernium, had no legal status but could be remarkably stable and affectionate. When slaves were freed, they often formalized these relationships through proper marriage ceremonies, sometimes after decades of living together and raising children. Military marriages presented their own challenges. Roman soldiers were forbidden to marry during their terms of service, which typically lasted 25 years. But many soldiers formed long-term relationships with local women in the provinces where they were stationed, and these relationships often produced children. When the soldiers retired and received their discharge and citizenship, they could formalize these relationships through marriage, legitimizing their children and establishing proper Roman households. The most politically significant marriage variation was the temporary marriage, or marriage of convenience, designed to cement specific political alliances. These marriages were often dissolved after a few years when the political situation changed, and both parties would remarry to create new alliances. Divorce was relatively easy under Roman law. Either party could initiate it simply by declaring their intention to end the marriage, so politicians could adjust their family relationships as quickly as they could change their voting patterns. Some Roman marriages were purely ceremonial, designed to maintain appearances while allowing both parties to pursue their real romantic interests elsewhere. This was particularly common among the imperial family, where political considerations were so overwhelming that personal compatibility was essentially irrelevant. These marriages required careful choreography to maintain the public illusion of marital harmony, while accommodating the private reality of mutual indifference or active dislike. The most unusual Roman marriage custom was the practice of matrimonium sine manu marriage, without transfer of authority, which allowed wealthy women to remain under their father's legal control rather than transferring to their husband's authority. This gave them significantly more legal and financial independence, allowing them to own property, inherit wealth, and even initiate divorce proceedings. It was a loophole that clever families used to protect their daughters' interests and maintain control over family wealth. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Roman marriage variations was how quickly the system could be abandoned entirely when it no longer served useful purposes. During the late Empire, when political instability made long-term alliances risky and economic decline made elaborate ceremonies unaffordable, many Romans simply lived together without formal marriage, creating households and raising children outside the traditional legal framework. Roman marriages, despite all their careful preparation and religious ceremony, ended in divorce with surprising frequency. The ease of Roman divorce reflected the fundamentally practical nature of Roman marriage. When a political alliance was no longer useful, when economic circumstances changed, or when personal incompatibility made cooperation impossible, it made sense to dissolve the partnership and try again with someone more suitable. Divorce could be initiated by either husband or wife, though the social and economic consequences were usually much more severe for women. A husband could simply declare his intention to end the marriage, and the wife would be required to return to her father's household, taking her dowry with her but leaving behind any children who belonged to their father's family under Roman law. A wife could also initiate divorce, but she needed to prove that her husband had failed in his basic marital obligations, usually through cruelty, abandonment, or failure to provide adequate financial support. The most common reason for divorce among the Roman elite was political expediency. When families found themselves on opposite sides of civil wars, political conflicts, or shifting alliances, marriages that had once been advantageous could become dangerous liabilities. A senator whose daughter was married to a political enemy might find himself suspected of disloyalty, while a general whose wife's family supported his rivals might face sabotage or betrayal. In such circumstances, divorce wasn't just personal, it was a matter of political survival. Financial problems also led to frequent divorces. Roman marriages were essentially business partnerships, and when those partnerships failed to generate the expected profits, dissolution often made economic sense. A wife whose family lost their wealth in bad investments or political purges might find herself divorced and return to her impoverished relatives. A husband whose business ventures failed might be abandoned by a wife whose family could no longer afford to subsidize his losses. Personal incompatibility, while less commonly acknowledged, was also a factor in many Roman divorces. Letters and literature from the period describe couples who simply couldn't live together, husbands who found their wives boring or difficult, wives who were disgusted by their husband's behavior or personal habits, couples who discovered that their personalities, interests, or values were fundamentally incompatible. While Romans didn't expect marriage to be based on romantic love, they did expect it to be workable as a domestic partnership. Adultery was grounds for divorce, but the standards were dramatically different for husbands and wives. A wife who committed adultery was legally required to be divorced by her husband, and she could face criminal prosecution, exile, or even death. A husband's adultery, on the other hand, was generally ignored unless it involved relationships with other men's wives, or became so flagrant that it created political problems. Roman law and custom assumed that men would have sexual relationships outside marriage, but women were expected to be absolutely faithful. The divorce process itself was surprisingly simple and undramatic. There were no lengthy legal proceedings, no division of assets beyond the return of the dowry, and no custody battles since children automatically remained with their fathers. The couple simply declared their intention to end the marriage, usually in front of witnesses, and went their separate ways. The wife packed her personal belongings and returned to her father's house, while the husband kept the family home, the slaves, and the children. But the social and political consequences of divorce could be devastating, particularly for women. A divorced woman faced significant challenges in remarrying, especially if the divorce involved scandal or accusations of misconduct. She might find herself permanently separated from her children, who would be raised by their father's new wife. Her family might lose important political connections or business relationships that had been built around the marriage alliance. Some divorces became public spectacles that damaged entire families' reputations and political prospects. When prominent Romans divorced, amid accusations of adultery, treason, or other serious misconduct, the proceedings could drag in multiple families, destroy political careers, and create lasting feuds that affected Roman politics for generations. The divorce of Mark Antony and Octavia, for example, was one of the factors that led to the civil war between Antony and Octavian that ultimately ended the Roman Republic. Remarriage after divorce was common and expected, particularly for women of childbearing age. A divorced woman's family would immediately begin negotiations for a new marriage alliance, often within months of the divorce being finalized. The goal was to minimize the political and economic damage from the failed marriage, while creating new opportunities for family advancement. Some Roman women married and divorced multiple times, creating complex webs of relationships that connected them to dozens of powerful families. The ease of Roman divorce had significant effects on Roman society and culture. It made marriage a much more fluid and temporary institution than in societies where divorce was difficult or impossible. It created a class of women who had experience managing multiple households and navigating complex family relationships. And it meant that Roman children often grew up in blended families with step-parents half-siblings, and complex loyalties that reflected their parents' political and economic strategies. As Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire under Augustus, marriage became an increasingly public and political institution. The emperors understood that their personal relationships, family arrangements, and domestic policies had implications for the entire empire, and they used marriage as a tool of statecraft in ways that would have made earlier Roman politicians blush. Augustus himself was a master of matrimonial politics. His own marriage to Livia was a calculated political move, designed to unite two powerful families and strengthen his position as Rome's first emperor. But Augustus went further, using his daughter Julia and his stepsons, and adopted sons as pawns in an elaborate chess game of dynastic succession. Julia was married 3 times, each marriage designed to produce potential heirs to the imperial throne and cement alliances with important political families. The emperor's marriage policies weren't limited to his own family. Augustus passed legislation requiring all unmarried senators and wealthy citizens to marry and produce children, with significant financial penalties for those who remained single or childless. The goal was to increase the birth rate among the Roman elite and ensure that the empire would have a steady supply of qualified administrators and military commanders. Marriage became a civic duty rather than a personal choice. Imperial weddings themselves became elaborate state occasions that combined traditional Roman ceremony with new elements designed to emphasize the divine nature of imperial authority. When members of the imperial family married, the ceremonies included sacrifices to the deified emperors, parades through the streets of Rome, public games and entertainments, and distributions of money and food to the Roman people. These weren't just family celebrations. They were political theatre designed to reinforce the imperial family's connection to Roman tradition, while demonstrating their unique status as semi-divine rulers. The empress herself became a political figure whose behavior and relationships had implications for the entire empire. Livia, Augustus's wife, was arguably the most powerful woman in Roman history, wielding influence over imperial policy, managing vast financial resources, and playing a crucial role in determining the succession. Later empresses like Agrippina the Younger and Julia Domna were active participants in political intrigue, military campaigns, and administrative decision-making. But imperial marriage also created new forms of scandal and controversy. When emperors divorced their wives for political reasons, remarried to cement new alliances, or engaged in sexual relationships that violated traditional Roman moral standards, their behavior became the subject of empire-wide gossip and political debate. The marital problems of Caligula, Nero, and other emperors weren't just personal scandals. They were constitutional crises that affected the stability of the entire government. The imperial court developed elaborate protocols for managing the emperor's marriage and family relationships. There were specific ceremonies for imperial engagements, weddings, anniversaries, and divorces. There were rules governing which members of the imperial family could marry whom, and under what circumstances. There were procedures for adopting potential heirs, legitimizing illegitimate children, and managing the complex inheritance issues that arose when emperors died without clear successors. Imperial marriage also became a tool of foreign policy. Roman emperors negotiated marriage alliances with barbarian kings, client rulers, and other foreign leaders as a way of cementing diplomatic relationships and extending Roman influence. These marriages often involved elaborate ceremonies that combined Roman traditions with local customs, creating hybrid rituals that reflected the multicultural nature of the Roman Empire. The emperor's marriage policies had profound effects on Roman society as a whole. The requirement that wealthy citizens marry and produce children created a marriage market that emphasized fertility and childbearing over other considerations. The emperor's own marital behavior set standards that other Romans felt pressured to follow, even when those standards changed rapidly based on political circumstances. Some emperors used marriage as a way of rewarding loyal supporters or punishing enemies. They could arrange marriages between their favourites and wealthy heiresses, or they could prevent their enemies from making advantageous marriage alliances. Imperial approval became necessary for marriages between prominent families, giving the emperor effective veto power over the political and economic relationships that shaped Roman society. But perhaps the most significant change was the way imperial marriage affected women's roles in Roman society. Empresses and other women in the imperial family became public figures with their own political influence, financial resources, and policy agendas. This created new opportunities for ambitious women throughout the empire, as well as new forms of competition and conflict between women who sought to advance their family's interests through marriage and political maneuvering. The rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire brought the most fundamental changes to marriage customs since the founding of Rome itself. Christian theology introduced radically new ideas about the purpose of marriage, the relationship between husbands and wives, and the role of sexual desire in human relationships. These ideas didn't replace Roman marriage customs overnight, but they gradually transformed them in ways that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations of Romans. The most revolutionary Christian idea was that marriage should be based on mutual consent and affection rather than political or economic calculation. Christian writers argued that husbands and wives should love each other, that marriage should be a partnership between equals, and that sexual relationships should be expressions of marital love rather than mere reproductive necessity. This wasn't just different from traditional Roman practice, it was almost incomprehensible to Romans who had been raised to think of marriage as a business arrangement. Christianity also introduced the concept of marital permanence. While Romans could divorce and remarry relatively easily, Christian doctrine taught that marriage was a sacred bond that could only be dissolved by death. Divorce became much more difficult, and remarriage after divorce was generally forbidden. This created new forms of marital stability, but it also trapped people in unhappy or abusive relationships that they couldn't escape through traditional Roman legal procedures. The Christian emphasis on sexual morality also transformed Roman marriage customs. Early Christian writers preached that sexual desire was inherently sinful and that even marital sex should be limited to reproduction. This was a dramatic departure from Roman attitudes, which had generally viewed sexual pleasure as natural and healthy as long as it was properly channeled. Christian couples were encouraged to practice sexual abstinence, to avoid contraception, and to view their physical relationship as a necessary evil rather than a source of joy. Christian wedding ceremonies gradually incorporated new elements that emphasized the spiritual dimension of marriage. Prayers replaced sacrifice as the primary religious observance. Christian priests began to play larger roles in wedding ceremonies, offering blessings and performing rituals that connected the couple to the Christian community rather than to traditional Roman gods. The wedding ceremony itself became a religious service rather than a domestic celebration. But the transformation wasn't immediate or complete. For several centuries after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, wedding customs remained a hybrid of traditional Roman practices and new Christian innovations. Wealthy families continued to negotiate elaborate marriage contracts, to exchange substantial dowries, and to use marriage as a tool of political and economic advancement. They simply added Christian prayers and blessings to ceremonies that remained fundamentally Roman in structure and purpose. The most significant long-term change was the Christian emphasis on female virtue and sexual purity. While Roman women had always been expected to be faithful to their husbands, Christian doctrine extended this expectation to include complete sexual abstinence before marriage, modest behavior in public, and subordination to male authority in both religious and domestic contexts. Christian wives were expected to be more submissive, more pious, and more focused on domestic duties than their pagan predecessors. Christian marriage also became more inclusive in some ways and more restrictive in others. Christianity taught that all people, regardless of social class, were equal in God's eyes. which meant that marriages between slaves and free persons, or between Romans and foreigners, could be blessed by the church even if they weren't recognized by Roman law. But Christian doctrine also forbidden marriages between Christians and non-Christians, creating new forms of religious segregation that had been less important in traditional Roman society. The Christian church gradually developed its own marriage law and procedures that sometimes conflicted with Roman civil law. Christian marriages had to be blessed by priests, witnessed by the Christian community, and conducted according to church doctrine. Couples who married in purely civil ceremonies might not be considered properly married by the church, while couples who married in Christian ceremonies might not have full legal rights under Roman law. Perhaps the most important change was the Christian idea that marriage was a spiritual institution rather than just a social and economic arrangement. Christian theology taught that marriage was a sacrament, a sacred bond that reflected the relationship between Christ and the church. This gave marriage a religious significance that it had never had in traditional Roman culture, and it created new expectations for marital behavior, sexual conduct, and family relationships. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they weren't universally accepted. Many Romans continued to practice traditional marriage customs long after Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Wealthy families continued to arrange marriages for political and economic reasons, even if they added Christian ceremonies to traditional Roman practices. The transformation of Roman marriage was a gradual process that took several centuries to complete, and it left behind a hybrid institution that combined elements of Roman law, Christian theology, and barbarian customs from the various peoples who invaded the collapsing empire. As the Roman Empire entered its long, slow decline in the 4th and 5th centuries, the elaborate marriage customs that had defined Roman society for centuries began to unravel along with everything else. The political instability, economic collapse, and social chaos that characterized the late empire made the old forms of matrimonial alliance increasingly irrelevant and often impossible to maintain. The traditional Roman marriage system had depended on several assumptions that were no longer valid in the collapsing empire. It assumed that families would remain wealthy and politically influential for generations, that property could be safely inherited and managed, that political alliances would provide lasting benefits, and that Roman law would continue to protect the complex legal arrangements that marriage contracts required. As these assumptions proved false, the marriage system that had been built around them began to break down. Wealthy Roman families found it increasingly difficult to maintain the elaborate households that had made their marriage alliances valuable. The villas, urban properties, and agricultural estates that had provided the economic foundation for Roman marriage were being destroyed by barbarian invasions, abandoned due to economic collapse, or confiscated by increasingly desperate imperial governments. Families that had been powerful and wealthy for centuries suddenly found themselves impoverished refugees, with nothing to offer potential marriage partners except their names and their memories of past glory. The political dimension of Roman marriage also became meaningless as the imperial government lost control of its territory and its administrative apparatus. There was no point in arranging a marriage alliance with a senator when the Senate had no real power. No benefit to connecting your family with a general when the army was mostly composed of barbarian mercenaries who owed no loyalty to Rome. No advantage to marrying your daughter to a provincial governor when the provinces were being overrun by Germanic tribes who ignored Roman law entirely. The religious transformation of the empire also contributed to the breakdown of traditional marriage customs. As Christianity became more influential, the old Roman gods who had blessed traditional marriages were abandoned, and the elaborate religious ceremonies that had sanctified matrimonial alliances were replaced by simpler Christian rituals that emphasized spiritual rather than social bonds. The household shrines where Roman families had worshipped their ancestors were destroyed or abandoned, and the religious traditions that had given meaning to Roman marriage were forgotten. Perhaps most importantly, the social consensus that had supported Roman marriage customs simply disappeared. The late empire was a multicultural society where Romans lived alongside Goths, Vandals, Franks, and dozens of other barbarian peoples who had their own marriage customs and their own ideas about family relationships. The old Roman insistence on proper ceremony, legal documentation, and political calculations seemed irrelevant and often incomprehensible to these new populations. Many Romans simply abandoned formal marriage altogether. In a world where legal contracts might not be enforceable, where property might be confiscated at any moment, and where families might be scattered by war or economic collapse, the elaborate legal and financial arrangements that had characterized Roman marriage seemed pointless. Instead, couples lived together in informal relationships that could be easily dissolved when circumstances changed. The barbarian invasions also disrupted traditional Roman family structures in more direct ways. Roman women were captured and married to barbarian warriors, according to Germanic rather than Roman customs. Roman men found themselves living in barbarian territories where Roman law didn't apply, and where their Roman wives had no legal rights or protections. Children born from these mixed relationships grew up without clear cultural identities, following neither pure Roman nor pure barbarian customs. Some Roman families tried to maintain traditional marriage customs even as their world collapsed around them. They continued to negotiate elaborate dowries, even when they had little wealth to offer, to arrange political marriages, even when political power was meaningless, and to conduct religious ceremonies, even when the gods they honored were no longer officially recognized. These efforts were often touching in their futility, families clinging to the forms of their ancestors' civilization, even as the substance had been completely destroyed. The late imperial government made various attempts to regulate marriage and family relationships through legislation, but these laws were largely unenforceable and often ignored. The emperors who issued these decrees often controlled only small portions of the former empire, and their authority was rejected by both Roman rebels and barbarian rulers who had established their own kingdoms on former Roman territory. By the 6th century, Roman marriage customs had largely disappeared from most of the former empire, replaced by a patchwork of Christian, barbarian, and hybrid practices that varied widely from region to region. The elaborate ceremonies, complex legal arrangements, and sophisticated political calculations that had characterized Roman marriage for centuries had been reduced to historical curiosities, remembered in books, but no longer practiced by living communities. And so we reached the end of our journey through the labyrinthine world of Roman marriage, where love was optional, but property law was eternal, where romance took a back seat to political alliance, and where the most important wedding guest was often the family accountant. It's remarkable, really, how much effort the Romans put into ceremonies designed to celebrate arrangements that had been decided by spreadsheet. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of flame-coloured veils and sacrificial goats, of teenage brides learning to manage households larger than modern corporations, of wedding contracts that read like international treaties. Maybe you'll imagine the sound of those bawdy Roman wedding songs echoing through marble corridors, or picture dignified senators negotiating dowries with the intensity of modern merger specialists. The Romans believed that their marriage customs would last forever, that their careful blend of religion, law, and social calculation had created the perfect system for organizing human relationships. They thought their empire was eternal, their traditions unshakable, their way of life so obviously superior that it would naturally spread to the entire world. They were wrong about the empire, but perhaps not entirely wrong about the traditions. Next time you attend a modern wedding, with its white dress echoing the Roman tunica recta, its ring ceremony borrowed from Roman tradition, its elaborate reception that would make a Roman wedding feast look modest, remember that you're witnessing the latest iteration of a very old story. The details have changed, the gods have different names, and we've added the revolutionary idea that the bride and groom should actually like each other. But the fundamental human drama remains the same. Two families coming together, two lives intertwining, two futures being negotiated over dinner and dancing. The Romans understood something that we sometimes forget in our romantic haze. Marriage is both deeply personal and profoundly political, both an intimate relationship and a social institution, both a private joy and a public performance. They may have gotten the balance wrong, prioritizing politics over passion and calculation over connection, but they weren't entirely misguided in recognizing that matrimony affects entire communities, not just the two people exchanging vows. So sleep well, and perhaps when you wake up, you'll have a new appreciation for weddings where the bride and groom have actually met before the ceremony, where love is considered more important than landholdings, and where the most complicated contract involved is usually the one with the photographer. The Romans gave us many gifts: roads, aqueducts, legal systems, and architectural principles that still shape our world. But perhaps their most enduring legacy is the idea that marriage is worth celebrating, that the joining of two lives deserves ceremony and witness, that love, even when it's carefully calculated and politically motivated, is still worth honouring with flowers, music, and the best feast you can afford. The Roman marriage ceremonies we've explored tonight were elaborate theatrical productions designed to transform private arrangements into public celebrations, to give religious meaning to financial transactions, to create beauty and joy around what were essentially business mergers. In their own way, they succeeded brilliantly, creating traditions that were so compelling, so emotionally satisfying, and so socially useful that they survived the collapse of the empire itself and continue to influence how we celebrate love and commitment more than 1,000 years later. Modern weddings may seem very different from their Roman predecessors. We've dispensed with the animal sacrifices and the ritualized abduction. We've added the radical notion that the couple should choose each other, and we've generally agreed that marriage should be about partnership rather than property transfer. But underneath all our contemporary innovations, the basic structure remains remarkably Roman. Families coming together, communities witnessing and blessing the union, celebration and ceremony marking the transition from single to married life. The Romans understood that marriage is one of the most hopeful of human institutions. The belief that two people can create something together that's larger and more meaningful than either could achieve alone. They may have expressed that hope through dowry negotiations and political alliances rather than romantic declarations, but the underlying optimism was the same. Every Roman wedding was an act of faith in the future, a bet that tomorrow would be better than today, a commitment to building something lasting in a world that often seemed chaotic and uncertain. And so, as you settle into sleep, surrounded by the quiet comforts of modernity central heating that would have amazed a Roman emperor, electric lights that would have seemed miraculous to a Roman bride, and the radical freedom to marry for love rather than advantage, remember those long-ago ceremonies where nervous teenagers in flame-coloured veils took their first steps into adult life, where families gathered to witness the creation of new alliances, where the future of an empire was shaped one carefully negotiated marriage contract at a time. The Romans are gone. Their marble palaces crumbled, their elaborate wedding ceremonies forgotten by all but historians and people who listen to bedtime history videos. But their hope endures the hope that love can be celebrated, that commitment can be honoured, that two people saying yes to each other is worth all the ceremony and celebration we can muster. In that hope, perhaps, we're all still Roman. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the surprisingly complex world of ancient matrimony. Until next time, when we'll explore another dusty corner of history where human nature meets human custom, and where the past whispers its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. Choas.